People enter leadership for a variety of reasons, and sometimes those reasons are good. And as we know, sometimes those reasons are not so good. Sometimes people enter leadership, I think, because they see something that needs to be changed, right? We see that often in grassroots politics. Someone will see something that needs to be changed, and they enter that political atmosphere because they think that they have a voice or an opinion that can make a difference. That's good, right? Then there are others who enter politics or enter leadership, maybe at a local level or even not even politics, but the PTA or the church council or their HOA, wherever it is that they're entering leadership, but they still do it in such a way that's not really quite pure because they're getting leadership because they like the attention and the power that leadership brings. They want to feed their own ego, and leadership gets them the attention that they need. Not such a good meaning for leadership. Others, I think, see leadership in a very different way. Sometimes I don't think we see leadership. Sometimes other people see it for us. Maybe you've had this experience. Sometimes other people bring it up and say it and recognize it in you so often that eventually you have to see that maybe God is saying something to you, right? I had a woman in one of my churches, excuse me. She was a local elementary school teacher, I believe 6th grade. She was a lovely woman. We all loved her. She wasn't super active in the church. She came back to the church shortly after we met, and I became pastor there. It was her home church. She then, as a teacher, was very comfortable with public speaking, and so she became, in the Methodist church, what we called a lay speaker, which is a lay person who is trained to lead worship and preach. So she was one of the people, those cadre of people I would use when I went on vacation. She would take turns leading the service. The first week, Robin preached, and everyone said, "Wow, when are you going to seminary, girl?" And she laughed and laughed and laughed. Second time she preached, "You need to get in seminary, girl." And she laughed and laughed and laughed. The third time she preached, "Do you not hear God's call? Are you the only person in this church who doesn't see the hand of God in your life?" By the end of that year, she had enrolled in a Master's of Divinity program at the seminary and had given her resignation in teaching. She's been ordained ever since. Sometimes I don't think we see ourselves in the roles that maybe other people will say, "Do you not see that you're gifted for this? Have you considered this? Because I really think God is speaking." Today's scriptures talk about different kinds of leaders, and it does so apply to the church and the world and our life as disciples. I wanted to address it. Saul is the first king of Israel. We talked last week a little bit about Saul. Remember, Israel wanted a king to be like the other nations, quote unquote. Here's the problem. If you remember the story of Israel, they were created to be separate from the other nations. You're not called to be like them. You're called to be a light to them. You're called to be set apart. You are God's chosen. I don't want you to be like everybody else. That was the point. Otherwise, I would have left you in Egypt. Right? That wasn't the point. So Samuel gives in, and God relents and says, okay, give them what they need, but make sure you tell them a king is not going to be what they want. Make sure you tell them, I told you so, because God told him so. The king's going to overtax you. He's going to conscript your sons into military service, and he's going to take your daughters to serve his courtiers. The king is not going to have your interest. God is your king, not human sovereigns. Switch to today's reading, and Saul is now no longer in favor with God or with Samuel. Saul has lost favor for a couple of reasons. Twice, he has decided he knew what was better than God for Israel. At one point, Saul is going to war, and he decides to take it on himself to offer the sacrifice. He decides he is going to do what needs to be done to gain favor to win the war. What's the problem with that? The problem with that is this. Every other, and these are things you really don't know if you just read the Bible itself. That's why you need to have somebody help you understand it. The problem with it is every other nation around him believed their leaders were divine. Your leaders are holy. They're divine. They're put by God, right? If you had read the Roman coin of Caesar several generations later, you would have seen that it said Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. Our leaders are divine. They are somehow set in place by God and share in God. That's not so with Israel. Israel was clear. There is one God. Our leaders are leaders. But there is one God in whom we trust. It is not the king. So for Saul to take that on himself meant that he was becoming like the other country's leaders. And God said, no, you don't call the shots, mister. I do. Later on, Samuel does come and convict Saul, and Saul laments, but Saul doesn't really lament. It's what we call imperfect contrition. He got caught his hand in the cookie jar and was sorry he got caught. He wasn't sorry he was eating cookies. Okay? That's imperfect contrition. To put it in 3-year-old language, we've all been there with kids, right? Okay? Now, what happens later? Case in point. Saul is told to fight the Amalekites, right? And Saul is told, and he does. But God says through Samuel, do not take anything for yourself. What does he do? He spares the best, not just some, the best. The cream of the crop of everything is spared, and the king himself is spared. Why? Because Saul is merciful? No. Because Saul is greedy, and he wants power. I want the best of this for me, and if I hold the king hostage, I'm going to have power. He even says, all the world will see what Saul has done. It's all about exalting him, not exalting God. It's really, when you think of it, and this is an aside, but it's an important aside, it reminded me of the story of the Garden of Eden. It's all about that kind of sin, right? In the Garden of Eden, we see the story being told, and again, it's a metaphor, right? No one was there to write it. We know that. It's a metaphor, but it's the early churches and early people of faith's witness to what they believe to be the truths of their relationship with God. So even though it's a metaphor, it doesn't mean it's not important and there aren't truths in the story. The truth of the Garden of Eden had nothing to do with an apple. Right? Eve ate an apple. An apple is not in the story. We added that. It's not in the Bible, right? I was growing up one time and heard somebody say to somebody else, "What's about sex?" It's not about sex. Those are really naive theologies. The fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, fruit is something you get when something comes to full fruition, correct? It's the fruit of something, right? The fruit of your work, the fruit of your labors. Right? The fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. Who chooses good and evil? God. When I choose for myself what is good and evil, I have put myself in the place of the one who is to choose for me. God has set before you life and death. The scriptures say, this day choose life. Right? Different scripture. But in the Garden of Eden, the problem with Adam and Eve is not that they ate a fruit, it's that they chose for themselves the path their life would take. They were choosing other ways. That's what Saul's doing. I know what God is saying, but I'm going to do this because it glorifies me. It makes me look good. Later, we see David in today's story. Direct contrast to King Saul. David trusted in God, a shepherd king. One of the writers says that the shepherd king David probably was even too really young to be a shepherd at this point. It wasn't that they left him in the field and forgot about him. His family didn't think he was even worthy of being called in the house to be seen. Like, he was just, here are all my capable sons. Here are all my older sons. Here are all the sons I think have these qualities. God says none of these. There's got to be another one somewhere. Well, yeah, there's you don't want David to. No. Bring him in. And God says, this is the one. He was the mustard seed, so to speak, that everyone thought couldn't grow into the great king. And he did. You see, David was a shepherd king, too young to rule. He was a boy. Some people say 11, 12, 13 years old at this point. But David had a humble heart that knew the gift of genuine love and concern for those around him. David was a direct contrast to Saul, a leader who wanted to exalt the people, as opposed to a leader who wanted to exalt himself by stepping on the necks of those he was called to serve. David sought God's glory, not his own. The psalm for the day we didn't read. Had I thought of it ahead of time, I would have put it in the liturgy for today. So let me read it to you. Psalm 20, the words attributed to David say this: "The Lord answer you in the day of trouble. The name of God of Jacob protect you. May God send you help from the sanctuary and give you support from Zion. Now I know that the Lord will help the anointed and will answer them from holy heaven, and mighty victories will be by God's right hand. Some trust in chariots, some trust in horses, but we will trust in the name of the Lord our God." What a difference between David and Saul, isn't it? Let all the generations say what Saul has done. And David says, some put their trust in chariots and horses and earthly powers. We trust in God to be our salvation, for it's God who will give us deliverance. It's that humility, that servant leadership that David lifts up and that's honored by God and by the people. Now, you might say this, because my initial thought was, but David was not perfect. Did David sin? Oh, yeah. Yeah, we're going to get there because this story continues for several weeks, and we're going to talk a little bit about David's sinful side. The difference is this, in my mind. When Saul is confronted with his sin, he kind of says, oh, my bad. Don't you love that? Don't you love that apology? When someone does something, you go, my bad. That's not an apology. That's like the least unapologetic apology ever. My bad. That's Saul. When David is approached about his sins, he laments. He's sorrowful. He says, my God, how could I do that? You're right. That was really bad. I need to do different. And he does. So the difference between Saul's sins and David's sins are that Saul kind of goes, oops, sorry. And David says, wow, yeah, I see it. I need to do better. And he means it. Good leaders are humble leaders. Good leaders raise up those they serve. Sometimes God raises unlikely leaders, right? Even in our own day. If I said to you the youngest winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, would you say Malala? A young 15-year-old girl who stood up and spoke against the oppression of the Taliban and stood for the education of young girls, supported by her father, a teacher, in a culture that says that girls and women should not be educated. Malala was shot in the head to silence her. She survived, and to this day, I love the reading that one commentator did when he said, their attempt at silencing her just magnified her voice. An unlikely leader rose in that moment, the youngest winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, and to this day still stands as a beacon for education and equality for women in an oppressive regime. Sometimes God calls us to assume unlikely leadership too. Sometimes it's in church. It might be in the PTA at your school, your kid's school. It might be in your union at work. It might be in your HOA in your community. It might be formal leadership in your community. Maybe sometimes you feel there's a difference that your gifts can make. And maybe sometimes other people say, do you not see how God uses you? Are you the only person in your life who doesn't see your gifts? Use them. The lesson from the scriptures today is really clear. Rely on God. Trust in the Lord. Serve as a servant, not as one who does it for accolades, attention, and power. Remember that being faithful is more important than being popular. It's nice to be popular. It's more important to be faithful. And lastly, when people look to you, remember not to be like Saul, but to be like David. When people look to you, point them to God. Amen.